I watched my brother's smug smile vanish as he stared at my tablet screen. My parents had just ambushed me at a five-star dinner, demanding the password to my banking app so they could hand my $336,000 life savings over to him and his entitled wife. They thought an outdated legal document gave them the ultimate power to drain my accounts and ruin my life. What they did not know was that I had already set a financial trap so devastating, it was about to trigger a federal lockdown on their entire existence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to use you. The tension in the private dining room of Atlanta's most exclusive Buckhead Steakhouse was thick enough to cut with a knife. I was 29 years old, working as a senior financial strategist, and I had been invited to what I was told was a celebration of my recent industry award. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated ambush. The air smelled of expensive roasted garlic and aged wine, but all I could feel was the familiar, suffocating weight of my family's expectations. My father Harrison reached into his tailored suit jacket and threw a folded, slightly yellowed document onto the center of the table. It landed with a soft thud right next to my untouched glass of sparkling water. It was a power of attorney form, signed by me when I was just 18 years old, back when I still blindly believed my parents had my best interests at heart. My mother. Vivian leaned forward, her designer jewelry, catching the dim light of the crystal chandelier above us. Unlock the banking application, Naomi, she demanded, her voice sharp and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. We know you have exactly $336,000 sitting in your high-yield savings account. Marcus needs it. He is expanding his investment firm, and you are going to transfer the funds to his account tonight. Family supports family, and it is your turn to do your part. I stared at her, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. They had been tracking my finances behind my back. They had kept that old, forgotten legal document hidden away, specifically for a moment like this, treating my hard-earned money as a backup fund for their golden child. For years, I had been the family workhorse. I was the one who worked 3 jobs during college to pay off the massive debt my parents secretly took out in my name to buy Marcus his first luxury sports car. I was the one who quietly funded half of his lavish $200,000 wedding just to save my parents from public embarrassment in their elite social circles. They viewed me as nothing more than a living, breathing cash machine. Before I could even respond to my mother's demand, my sister-in-law, Chloe, let out a soft, mocking laugh. She took a slow sip of her dirty martini, the olives clicking against the expensive glass. She was white, came from a wealthy old money family, and never missed an opportunity to inject her quiet superiority into every conversation we had. Be reasonable, Naomi, Chloe said, resting her manicured hand on my brother's arm. You are single, you have no husband, no children. What do you possibly need that kind of money for? Marcus and I are putting a down payment on a beautiful $5 million mansion in Alpharetta. Honestly, as a Black woman, you should be grateful my family has done so much to elevate the Caldwell name in Atlanta society. The least you can do is hand over the password and play your part. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the heavy air of the dining room. She sat there, cloaked in her privilege, casually demanding the money I had sacrificed my entire 20s to build, while reminding me of my supposed place in their social hierarchy. Marcus just sat there with a confident smirk, straightening his expensive tie, fully expecting me to surrender. A decade ago, I would have cried. I would have argued, begged for their love, and eventually caved to their demands, just to keep the peace and avoid my mother's wrath. I would have let them strip me of my dignity and my security. But I was no longer that scared, desperate girl. I took a slow, deep breath and smoothed an invisible wrinkle from my burgundy silk suit. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I offered them a bright, perfectly composed smile. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my tablet, placing it gently on the polished wood table. I opened the banking application, my fingers flying across the screen as I typed in my master password. The green login button illuminated the dark space between us. I slid the device directly across the table, stopping it right in front of my brother's hands. Be my guest, brother, I said, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. Take whatever you think belongs to you. Marcus practically snatched the tablet from the polished mahogany table. He did not even look at me. His eyes were glued to the glowing screen, his thumb hovering over the interface with an eagerness that made my stomach turn. Chloe leaned in, so close. Her shoulder brushed his, her earlier sophisticated posture, completely abandoned for pure unfiltered greed. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, muttering something about how I was finally acting like a proper daughter and honoring the Caldwell family name. He tapped the screen. The loading icon spun for a fraction of a second. I sat perfectly still watching his face. I watched the exact moment his arrogant, entitled smirk shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His hand began to tremble, the tablet shaking against the heavy crystal water glasses on the table. He blinked rapidly, leaning closer to the screen as if his eyes were deceiving him. "This cannot be right," Marcus whispered frantically, tapping the screen again and again. "Naomi, what is this? Where is it?" Chloe snatched the tablet from his hands with an annoyed huff, turning it toward herself. Her perfectly contoured face dropped. "Zero," she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the private dining room walls. "What do you mean the balance is $0, Harrison?" She drained it. The little brat hid the money. My father slammed his hands down on the table, the silverware rattling against the fine china. "What kind of game are you playing, Naomi?" He demanded, his voice dropping into that dangerous, threatening register he used to intimidate me when I was a child. "You better transfer those funds right now before I call our attorneys." I slowly picked up my sparkling water, took a leisurely sip, and set the glass down exactly on the coaster. I did not hide anything I said, my voice steady, professional, and entirely devoid of fear. I simply secured my assets. Did you honestly think a senior financial strategist would leave $336,000 sitting in an unprotected standard savings account when she knows her family has a long documented history of financial boundary crossing? I looked directly at my father, holding his furious gaze. "You are getting sloppy, Dad. When you walked into the downtown Buckhead Bank branch last Thursday to verify that 11-year-old power of attorney, you forgot a very crucial detail. I used to work at that branch. The regional manager is a close personal friend of mine. He called me the exact second you walked out the revolving doors." My father's jaw clenched tightly, a thick vein pulsing in his neck. My mother looked at him in absolute shock, realizing their highly secretive mission to rob me blind had been compromised days ago. The moment I got that phone call, I continued my tone conversational, but razor sharp. I moved every single penny of my liquid assets into an irrevocable blind trust. It is a legal fortress. No power of attorney, especially a general outdated one, signed by a naive 18-year-old, can pierce it. My money is completely untouchable by you, by Mom, and especially by your golden boy. Marcus was hyperventilating now. He tugged violently at his expensive silk tie as if it were choking him. "But that is not the best part," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the table. "Marcus, why do you not read the bright red text flashing at the top of the screen? The prompt you just blindly clicked accept on because you were too greedy to read the terms and conditions." Marcus stared at the tablet in Chloe's hands. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground crumble beneath his custom Italian loafers. "Account consolidated," he read aloud, his voice cracking and utterly devoid of its usual arrogance. "You are now legally liable for a $1.2 million margin call. Federal Reserve lock activated." Chloe dropped the tablet onto the table as if it had physically burned her. "A margin call?" she demanded, looking frantically between Marcus and me. "Marcus, what is she talking about? What is a margin call?" I smiled at her confusion, but I did not give her the whole truth yet. A margin call is what happens when a leveraged investment account loses enough value that the lender demands immediate cash or additional collateral, I explained. Marcus had borrowed aggressively against assets he claimed were stable, then buried those obligations behind layers of linked accounts, so the family would keep seeing the image of a successful investment executive. The market moved against those positions last week, I continued, and the lenders stopped trusting the numbers attached to his profile. They demanded $1.2 million immediately. Marcus did not have it. That was why he suddenly needed my $336,000 tonight. The federal lock on the screen did not prove every crime he had committed. It proved something simpler and more dangerous. The financial structure he had been hiding was in default. The institutions behind it were tracing ownership, and he was desperate to keep anyone at this table from asking what his company was actually doing with investor money. My mother grabbed her chest, gasping for air. "This is a lie. Marcus is a successful CEO. You are just jealous of him. You have always been jealous of him." I ignored her completely and kept my eyes locked on Marcus, who was now sweating profusely. I used my corporate security clearance to flag this specific banking profile, I explained, pointing at the tablet. When Marcus entered his biometric thumbprint and clicked confirm ownership just now, attempting to drain my supposed funds, he effectively bypassed his own firewall. He legally linked his personal identity to his hidden defaulted accounts. He just claimed ownership of a $1.2 million federal debt right in front of multiple witnesses. Chloe stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. "You set him up!" she screamed, her face turning a blotchy red. Her white privilege flared up instantly, expecting her outrage to automatically command the room. "You malicious, vindictive little fraud. My family will destroy you for this. My father is the biggest investor in Marcus's firm. He will have you thrown in federal prison by morning." I looked at her, my expression shifting from polite amusement to absolute ice. "Then call your father right now, Chloe," I said quietly. "Ask him why his primary investment account stopped accepting transfers 10 minutes ago. Ask him why every account tied to Marcus's fund was placed under an emergency compliance freeze. He is not going to have time to threaten me tonight. His money is already locked behind the same investigation swallowing your husband's operation." Chloe stared at me, the color draining from her perfectly contoured face. She grabbed her smartphone with shaking hands and dialed her father's private number. Instead of his voice, a recorded security message informed her that outgoing transfers had been suspended pending review. She tried again. The same message answered. For the first time that night, her arrogance cracked into real fear. Her father had not been arrested, not yet. But the fortune she had spent her entire life treating as an unlimited shield was suddenly inaccessible. She stared at the dark phone screen, finally understanding that Marcus's fraud had spread beyond our table and into the accounts of the people who financed his illusion. Seconds earlier, she had threatened me with her father's wealth. Now that wealth was frozen, and she had no idea what the investigators would uncover next. The silence in the room finally shattered when my father Harrison erupted. He was a man who had spent his entire life commanding boardrooms and intimidating anyone who dared to question his authority. Seeing his carefully constructed empire of lies begin to collapse pushed him over the edge. He stood up so aggressively that his heavy oak dining chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. His chest was heaving, his face contorted into a mask of pure rage, and a thick vein pulsed visibly at his temple. He grabbed his crystal wine glass, entirely filled with an expensive vintage red wine, and hurled it blindly across the room. The heavy glass smashed against the textured wallpaper with a deafening crash. Sharp crystal shards rained down onto the carpet, and deep crimson stains dripped down the pristine white walls like fresh blood. Outside our private dining room, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, pausing the restaurant staff, clearly too terrified to intervene in the violent outburst of one of their wealthiest patrons. "You malicious little thief!" my father roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. He leaned over the table, trying to use his towering physical presence to make me shrink just as he had done when I was a terrified teenager. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? You think you can commit cyberterrorism against your own blood and walk away from this table? I am calling the Atlanta Police Department right now. I am calling every contact I have at the precinct. I will have you arrested for wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement before they even serve the dessert course. You will spend the best years of your life rotting in a federal penitentiary for trying to ruin this family." I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I held his furious gaze with a cold, unwavering calm that only seemed to enrage him further. "You can call whoever you want, Dad," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly regulated. "But you might want to explain to the police how it is my fault that a 32-year-old man willingly logged into an application using his own biometric thumbprint and happily clicked a button to assume ownership of a $1.2 million margin call. There was no hack. There was no identity theft. Marcus signed his own financial death warrant because he was too blinded by greed to read the screen. The federal banking system does not care about your temper tantrums, and the police cannot arrest me for letting your son voluntarily claim his own hidden debt. Before my father could formulate a response, my mother completely lost her mind. Vivian Caldwell, the woman who prided herself on being the epitome of grace, elegance, and composure within the Atlanta high society, absolutely snapped. The polished matriarch facade melted away, revealing the desperate, grasping parasite she truly was. She lunged across the wide dining table, her heavy pearl necklace swinging violently as she reached for me. Her hands adorned with expensive rings clamped down hard onto my forearm. Her perfectly manicured nails dug painfully deep into the silk fabric of my suit, scratching against my skin. "You reverse this right now, Naomi!" she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically between me and the tablet that still displayed Marcus's ruined financial future. "You fix this immediately. You pull that money out of whatever blind trust you hid it in, and you pay off this margin call. You are his sister. It is your absolute duty to protect him. I gave you life, and you owe this family everything you have." I looked down at her hands, gripping my arm, feeling a profound sense of disgust. I did not pull away immediately. I wanted her to feel the weight of her own desperation. "I owe this family nothing," I said quietly. "You owe us everything," she shrieked, her grip tightening until my arm throbbed. She was so consumed by panic that she stopped caring about who was listening, openly vomiting the ugly hidden truths of our family dynamic right there in the dining room. "Who do you think paid for everything when things went wrong? You did. When Marcus wrecked that brand new Porsche Cayenne 3 years ago while driving under the influence, who do you think covered the $80,000 in property damages to keep him out of jail and keep his name out of the local papers? You did. We made you empty your entire retirement account so your brother would not have a criminal record." Chloe gasped, dropping her phone onto the table. She looked at Marcus in shock. "You told me that car was stolen," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "You told my parents it was stolen while you were at a charity gala." My mother ignored her daughter-in-law completely, her entire focus locked on me in a state of unhinged fury. And when Marcus and Chloe demanded a $200,000 luxury wedding at the Botanical Gardens to impress her snobby elite friends, "Who do you think paid for it?" My mother continued to scream, her face inches from mine. "Who do you think paid for the imported floral arrangements, the gourmet catering, and their 2-week honeymoon in the Maldives? You did. You handed us over $100,000 because that is what a good daughter does. You sacrificed your savings to protect the Caldwell name and maintain our status in this city. You were born to help your brother succeed, and you do not get to stop paying for his lifestyle just because you are throwing a jealous little tantrum." Her words echoed in the silent room. She had finally said it out loud. She had finally admitted that my sole purpose in her eyes was to be the financial sacrifice laid at the altar of my brother's ego. She genuinely believed that draining my accounts, stealing my peace, and forcing me to work 80-hour weeks to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle was simply my biological duty. She saw my bank account as their communal property. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling the last remaining microscopic thread of daughterly affection snap and wither away into nothing. Slowly and deliberately, I reached over with my free hand. I grabbed my mother's wrist and peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. I pushed her hand away with a firm, dismissive shove. She stumbled back into her chair, breathless and shaking. "I did not pay for that Porsche or that wedding out of duty, Mother," I said, my voice carrying a dangerous, chilling authority that made even my father step back. "I paid for those things because you emotionally blackmailed me. You threatened to disown me. You manipulated a young woman who desperately wanted her parents to love her as much as they loved her brother. You bled me dry to buy Marcus a fake throne, and then you had the audacity to sit back and watch him treat me like dirt." I stood up slowly, smoothing my suit jacket, towering over my mother, who was now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "The days of me financing your illusions are permanently over. You brought me to this restaurant tonight to rob me of my $336,000 life savings, so your golden boy could buy a $5 million mansion he does not deserve. But the only thing you accomplished tonight was ensuring that you all go down with his sinking ship. Across the table, Chloe began to hyperventilate. She buried her face in her hands, her carefully constructed world of white privilege, old money, and elite status completely imploding around her. She was married to a fraud. Her father's investments were locked in a federal investigation, and the lavish lifestyle she felt so entitled to was evaporating into thin air. Marcus was completely catatonic, staring blankly at the tablet screen that guaranteed his upcoming bankruptcy. Across the table, Chloe's breathing grew faster as she watched the only protections she understood disappear one by one. Her father's accounts were frozen. Marcus was exposed as a fraud. My parents were losing control of the room. Yet instead of questioning the man who had robbed her family, she turned her anger toward me. That reflex told me everything. Accountability was unfamiliar to her. Power was not. She slammed her palm against the table, the diamond on her finger striking the wood with a hard crack. "Do not sit there acting superior to us, Naomi," she snapped. "You think a few financial tricks make you untouchable. My family has spent generations building relationships in this city. Judges know our name. Bank presidents take our calls. Political donors sit at our table. People like you do not get to humiliate people like us and walk away smiling." Her voice sharpened as panic stripped away the polished manners she usually wore in public. She looked me up and down with open contempt. "You are still a single black woman who has spent your entire life trying to prove she belongs in rooms my family was born into. You can wear the suit, you can memorize the regulations, you can collect a few impressive job titles. But when the real institutions in Atlanta have to decide who they trust, they are not going to choose the rebellious daughter who turns on her own family." My mother did not correct her. My father did not defend me. Marcus did not even raise his head. The silence from my own family was louder than Chloe's insults. They were still willing to accept her contempt if it meant preserving access to her last name, her connections, and whatever remained of her father's money. Chloe leaned forward, mistaking their cowardice for proof that she was right. "I can make one phone call and put your name on every private blacklist that matters. I can make lenders stop returning your calls. I can make board members question your judgment. By tomorrow morning, every person who matters in this city will know that Naomi Caldwell is unstable, vindictive, and dangerous to do business with." I watched her finish, letting every word settle in the room. She believed she was describing the limits of my power. In reality, she was giving me the perfect opening to show her how little she understood about the business sitting directly beneath her husband's lies. I watched her spew her offensive microaggressions, weaponizing her background exactly as I knew she would. She truly believed her social status was an impenetrable shield. She thought the Caldwell family desperately needed her to validate our existence in high society. I did not interrupt her. I let her finish her desperate racist tirade. I let her dig her own grave right there in the private dining room. Then, with a slow, highly deliberate movement, I reached down to the floor next to my chair and picked up a thick, heavy manila folder. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a loud, satisfying smack right next to the spilled wine my father had caused earlier. "You talk a lot about your family and their deep roots, Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously soft and completely steady. "But you clearly have not been paying attention to what your brilliant husband has been planting in your own backyard." Chloe glared at the folder but stubbornly refused to touch it. Marcus, however, looked like he was about to pass out. He was staring at the manila envelope as if it contained a live explosive. "Go ahead, Chloe," I urged, gesturing gracefully to the folder. "Open it. Since you are so confident in Marcus and his incredible success, you should have absolutely no problem reviewing his latest quarterly reports." When she did not move, I reached over and flipped the heavy folder open myself. Dozens of high-resolution photographs, heavily highlighted bank statements, and certified financial records spilled across the mahogany table. "Let me explain how your husband's brilliant cryptocurrency investment firm actually operates," I announced to the room, making sure my parents were listening to every single word. "Marcus has never traded a single digital asset. He does not own any proprietary trading algorithms. His entire company is a textbook Ponzi scheme." My father froze, his phone slipping from his grip and clattering onto the table. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice suddenly hollow, the aggressive bluster completely gone. I am talking about massive federal fraud, Dad, I replied, not breaking eye contact with Chloe. For the last 2 years, Marcus has been taking millions of dollars from your wealthy friends at the country club, from the prominent members of our church congregation, and most heavily from Chloe's billionaire father. He took their massive initial investments and used them to pay off early investors to create the elaborate illusion of massive returns. But the vast majority of that capital never went into the market. It went straight into his pockets. I picked up a stack of bank records and pushed them directly in front of Chloe. He siphoned the money into offshore shell companies. He bought luxury cars, funded your lavish tropical vacations, and maintained his fake image as a self-made tech genius. He has been literally robbing your father blind to buy you those designer handbags, Chloe. Chloe's face was chalk white. She stared at the bank statements, her eyes rapidly scanning the highlighted numbers and the routing details. No, she whispered, shaking her head in fierce denial. No, my father's top financial advisors vetted his company. They audited his accounts thoroughly before we got married. They audited fake accounts. I corrected her swiftly, stripping away her last shred of hope. Marcus paid a disgraced accountant to forge his balance sheets and inflate his assets. But I do not just rely on paperwork. Look at the photographs, Chloe. Look at exactly where your family's money went. She slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the top photograph. It was a crystal-clear image of Marcus on the deck of a massive, luxurious yacht. But he was not alone. He was holding a glass of expensive champagne, his arm wrapped tightly around the bare waist of a stunning blonde woman in a tiny red bikini. They were kissing passionately, completely lost in the moment. That yacht is named the Golden Return, I explained, relishing the absolute devastation washing over Chloe's face as her perfect life shattered. Marcus bought it 8 months ago using $2.5 million directly transferred from your father's retirement fund. And the woman he is holding, that is Cassandra. She lives in a luxury penthouse in Miami, which Marcus also pays the monthly rent for. He visits her every other week when he tells you he is flying down to Florida for exclusive tech conferences. Chloe's hands shook violently. She dropped the photo and grabbed another, then another. There were pictures of Marcus and his mistress shopping at high-end boutiques, dining at exclusive beachfront restaurants, and entering a luxury condo building holding hands. There were printouts of Marcus's private text messages authorizing monthly transfers of $20,000 to Cassandra's personal bank account. He is not a successful CEO, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. He is a thief, a liar, and a serial cheater. He drained his investors dry to fund his secret double life. And when the market shifted last week and his early investors started demanding their money back, his entire house of cards collapsed. That is exactly why he was desperate to steal my $336,000 tonight. He thought he could use my life savings to plug a tiny hole in a massive, sinking ship. Chloe looked up at Marcus. Her arrogant, superior posture had completely vanished. She looked small, shattered, and utterly humiliated. The white privilege she had tried to wield against me just moments ago meant absolutely nothing in the face of her husband's monumental, disgusting betrayal. Marcus, she breathed, her voice cracking with raw pain and humiliation. Tell me this is a lie. Tell me she manufactured these photos to get back at us. Tell me you did not use my father's money to buy a yacht for some cheap tramp in Miami. Marcus could not even look her in the eye. He stared down at his lap, his shoulders hunched, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a cornered animal. His cowardly silence was the loudest confession in the room, confirming every single thing I had just exposed. The absolute silence in the room stretched until it felt like the walls were closing in on us. Marcus did not offer a single word of defense. He just sat there, staring at the floor, perfectly embodying the spineless coward I always knew he was. I watched Chloe process the ultimate betrayal. The man she thought was a brilliant tech billionaire was nothing but a common scam artist, using her father as a personal ATM to fund his Miami mistress. She let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She ripped the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it violently at Marcus. It hit his chest and bounced onto the floor, rolling away into the shadows. I want a divorce, Chloe hissed, her voice vibrating with pure hatred. I am calling my lawyers. I am calling the police. You are going to rot in a cell, Marcus. This was the exact moment any normal mother would have turned around and slapped her son across the face for bringing such monumental shame and criminality into the family. But Vivian Caldwell was not a normal mother. She was a woman completely blinded by her obsession with her golden child and her desperate need to maintain her elite social standing. Instead of holding Marcus accountable, my mother practically dove across the table toward Chloe. She grabbed Chloe's wrists, her eyes wide with frantic, sickening desperation. "Chloe, please," my mother begged, her voice dropping into a frantic whisper as she tried to contain the damage. "Please do not do this. Do not make a public scene. Think about the scandal. Think about the media. If you file for divorce now, it will destroy the Caldwell name, and it will humiliate your family in front of the entire city. We can fix this quietly. We can handle it internally. Marcus made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but he is a good man. You cannot leave him." Chloe snatched her hands away from my mother, as if she had just been touched by a disease. She looked at Vivian with utter repulsion. "Are you insane?" Chloe screamed, completely dropping her refined high society persona. "Your son stole millions of dollars from my father to buy a yacht for his mistress. He is a criminal. Stay away from me, Vivian. You are just as sick and twisted as he is." My mother burst into theatrical tears, sobbing about how the devil was trying to tear her perfect family apart. But my father Harrison did not cry. He realized that begging Chloe was a lost cause. He realized that the $1.2 million margin call was real, and that federal agents were actively dismantling his fake empire. He turned his head slowly, and his bloodshot eyes locked onto me. He marched around the edge of the large mahogany table, his heavy footsteps thudding against the floor. He stopped right in front of my chair, towering over me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate tyranny. "You are going to fix this, Naomi," my father commanded. His voice was no longer loud, but it was laced with a chilling, absolute expectation of obedience. "You are a senior financial strategist. You know how these institutional lenders operate. You are going to absorb this $1.2 million debt tonight." I slowly tilted my head, looking up at the man who had supposedly protected me my entire life. "Excuse me," I asked quietly. "You heard me," he spat, slamming his hand flat onto the back of my chair, trapping me in place. "You are going to leverage every single asset you own. You will liquidate your blind trust. You will mortgage whatever properties you have hidden. You will take out high-interest commercial loans. I do not care if you have to sell your own body on the street, Naomi. You will pay off this federal margin call, and you will save your brother from going to prison." The sheer, unfiltered toxicity of his words hung in the air. He had just demanded that his only daughter ruin her life, bankrupt her future, and willingly step into massive federal debt just to shield his fraudulent, cheating son from the consequences of his own crimes. He viewed me as nothing more than a human shield, a sacrificial lamb waiting to be slaughtered to protect Marcus. "Do you understand me?" my father growled, leaning his face so close to mine I could smell the expensive red wine on his breath. "You created this mess by exposing him. Now you will clean it up. Your reputation means absolutely nothing compared to the survival of this family. You will sign the assumption of debt paperwork tomorrow morning." I looked at the panicked, sweaty face of my father. I looked over at my mother, who was nodding vigorously in agreement through her tears, silently demanding I sacrifice my life for her golden boy. I looked at Marcus, who still refused to make eye contact with me, silently waiting for me to save him, just like I always did when we were younger. For 29 years, I had craved their love. I had worked myself to the bone trying to prove I was worthy of a seat at their table. But in that exact second, looking at their cowardly, parasitic faces, the last remaining chain of obligation snapped. I stood up. I moved with such sudden, sharp force that my father stumbled backward, startled by my complete lack of submission. I reached out and violently swatted his hand away from my chair. "Do not ever touch me again," I said. My voice was absolute ice. It sliced through the humid air of the private dining room, silencing even my mother's sobbing. "I am not your financial savior, Harrison. I am not your scapegoat. And as of this exact moment, I am absolutely no longer your daughter." My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. "Naomi, you cannot say that. We are your blood." "Blood is just a biological accident, Vivian. I snapped back, not even looking at her. You two are nothing but parasites. You bred me simply to have a reliable insurance policy for your precious son. You want to know who is going to pay the $1.2 million Marcus is. And when he cannot pay it, the federal government is going to seize your house, your cars, your country club memberships, and every last dime of your fake generational wealth. I am cutting all ties with this toxic wasteland of a family tonight. My father's face turned a violent shade of purple. The realization that I was actually walking away, that his ultimate safety net was officially gone, sent him into a blind, destructive panic. He reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out his smartphone, his hands shaking with uncontrolled rage. You think you can just walk away from us, my father roared, spit flying from his lips. You think you can act high and mighty just because you have a fancy corporate job? You are nothing. I built you. I paid for your education. I allowed you to be successful, and I can take it all away in a single phone call. He unlocked his phone and aggressively tapped the screen, holding it up like a weapon. I am calling the chief executive officer of your firm right now. My father threatened, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. He is my closest friend. We play golf every Saturday. I will tell him you are mentally unstable. I will tell him you committed cyber fraud against your own family. I will have you fired, stripped of your credentials, and blacklisted from every major financial institution in the state of Georgia before you even reach the parking lot. You will lose your career, your income, and your entire reputation tonight. He glared at me, panting heavily, expecting me to drop to my knees and beg for mercy. He expected the threat of losing my hard-earned career to be the ultimate leverage that would force me back into submission. I picked up my designer clutch from the table. I looked at his shaking hand holding the phone. I offered him a calm, utterly relaxed smile. Then you should press call, Dad, I said smoothly. You should definitely put him on speakerphone so the entire room can hear what your golf buddy has to say about my employment status. Go ahead, call him. My father did not hesitate. His massive ego simply would not allow him to back down from a direct challenge, especially one coming from the daughter he had spent 3 decades treating like a subordinate. He gripped his smartphone with white-knuckled intensity, completely determined to prove that he was the ultimate authority in this room and in my life. He aggressively tapped the screen, navigating to his contacts, and pressed the call button for the chief executive officer of my firm. He slammed the phone down onto the center of the dining table and hit the speaker button. The dial tone echoed loudly off the crystal glasses and the wood-paneled walls of the private room. My mother Vivian suddenly sat up perfectly straight. The hysterical, grasping woman from just a few moments ago vanished instantly, replaced by the polished, vindictive matriarch of the Caldwell family. She practically glowed with malicious anticipation. She adjusted her heavy pearl necklace and smoothed her designer dress, deeply comforted by the familiar exercise of corporate power. To her, this was the natural order of the world. A disobedient daughter was about to be publicly stripped of her livelihood, her independence, and her pride, all through a single phone call made by a powerful man. She looked at me with a sickeningly triumphant smirk, fully believing that within the next 2 minutes, I would be reduced to a jobless, disgraced outcast, with absolutely no choice but to crawl back and beg for their financial mercy. Chloe briefly stopped her quiet sobbing, looking up from her ruined engagement ring on the floor. Even in the midst of her own marital devastation, her inherent privilege drew her attention to the spectacle of my impending professional execution. Marcus remained frozen, his eyes hollow, but he too seemed to brace himself for my downfall. I simply sat back against the plush velvet of my chair. I crossed my legs, rested my hands loosely in my lap, and maintained a perfectly serene expression. I watched my father puff out his chest, preparing to perform his favorite role. The powerful, connected Atlanta elite, who could make or break a career with a snap of his fingers. The ringing stopped. The line connected with a sharp click. "Harrison, my man, what is going on?" The voice of my CEO, a man named Donovan, filtered through the speaker. Usually Donovan possessed the booming, overly confident voice of a seasoned Wall Street veteran. But tonight he sounded incredibly strange. His voice was tight, breathless, and laced with an underlying tension that my father completely failed to notice in his blind rage. "Donovan, I need you to do me a massive favor," my father boomed instantly, adopting his boisterous, commanding country club persona. His tone was dripping with the arrogant assumption that his request would be fulfilled without a single question. I am sitting here right now, dealing with a severe family emergency, and it unfortunately involves one of your senior financial strategists, my daughter Naomi. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second. I could practically hear Donovan stop breathing on the other end. But my father plowed ahead, completely oblivious to the sudden heavy shift in the atmosphere. It breaks my heart to say this about my own blood, Donovan, but Naomi has suffered a complete mental collapse. My father lied flawlessly, his voice dripping with fake paternal sorrow. She has become highly unstable, vindictive, and completely irrational. Just tonight, she attempted to commit severe cyber fraud against my son Marcus and his business accounts. She is acting out of pure malicious jealousy. As your friend, and as a major investor in your circles, I am calling to warn you that she has become a massive liability to your firm. She has absolutely zero family ethics, zero loyalty, and she cannot be trusted with your client's assets for another single second. My mother leaned forward toward the phone, eager to twist the knife even deeper. Donovan, this is Vivian Caldwell, she chimed in using her most sickeningly sweet, concerned voice. We are just so devastated. We tried to get her psychiatric help, but she is completely out of control. For the safety of your company's reputation, you need to cut ties with her immediately before she brings your entire operation down. My father nodded approvingly at my mother before delivering his final brutal demand. I need you to terminate her employment tonight, Donovan. I want her corporate access revoked immediately. I want her blacklisted from every partnered financial institution in the state of Georgia. She needs to understand that actions have severe consequences in the real world. My father leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at me with a dark, victorious glare, fully expecting to watch the light leave my eyes. He expected me to shatter. He thought his country club handshakes and golf course networking gave him the supreme power to erase a black woman's hard-earned career with one simple conversation. I did not break eye contact with him. I just offered a slow, knowing smile. We waited for Donovan to speak. We waited for the booming confirmation from the CEO, the verbal execution order that would validate my parents' toxic authority. But the speakerphone remained entirely silent. The silence stretched on for 5 seconds, then 10 seconds. It became thick, oppressive, and incredibly uncomfortable. The quiet was so absolute that I could hear the faint sound of traffic down on the Atlanta streets below. My father frowned, his confident posture slipping slightly. He leaned closer to the phone, tapping the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Donovan, my father, pressed a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. Are you still there? Did you hear what I said? I need her terminated immediately. Finally, a sound came through the speaker. It was a shaky, ragged exhale like a man who had just been punched squarely in the stomach. Harrison Donovan started. His voice was barely a whisper. The booming, arrogant Wall Street persona was completely obliterated. He sounded terrified. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a sheer cliff, staring down into the abyss. The raw fear radiating through the tiny phone speaker was so palpable that my mother's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of deep, unsettled confusion. Harrison, I am so sorry, Donovan stammered, his voice cracking uncontrollably. The words tumbled out of his mouth in a frantic, panicked rush. I cannot do that. I cannot help you. My father's face contorted in shock. What are you talking about, Donovan? We have been friends for a decade. I am telling you that your employee is a dangerous liability. Fire her right now. I cannot fire Naomi Harrison! Donovan gasped, sounding completely out of breath. I cannot fire her, and she is no longer my employee. The absolute confusion that washed over my father's face was almost comical. He stared down at his phone sitting in the center of the dining table, his thick eyebrows knitting together in a deep, angry scowl. He clearly could not process what he was hearing. In his rigid patriarchal mind, an employee could only leave a firm in two ways. They were either fired or they quit in disgrace. My mother, however, did not miss a beat. Vivian let out a sharp, triumphant laugh that echoed off the crystal glasses. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest with a look of supreme satisfaction. You see, Harrison, she announced, looking around the room as if she had just won a major legal victory. She already knew she was caught. She knew you were going to call, so she panicked and resigned before Donovan could fire her. Good riddance. Now she has absolutely zero income. She will be begging us for a place to stay by the end of the month. My father nodded slowly, a cruel smile returning to his face. He leaned closer to the speakerphone. Well, Donovan, if she already quit, then you just saved yourself the paperwork. But I still want you to make sure her professional reputation in Atlanta is completely burned. Harrison, please, you need to stop talking, Donovan begged. His voice was no longer just panicked. It was trembling with genuine unfiltered terror. You do not understand what you are doing right now. You are going to ruin me. My father frowned, his smile faltering. What is wrong with you, Donovan? Why are you acting like a frightened child? I am simply asking you to blacklist a former employee who betrayed my family. She did not resign. Harrison Donovan shouted, his voice cracking violently through the small speaker. She did not resign, and I did not fire her. You are not listening to me. The entire dining room went perfectly still. Chloe stopped wiping her tear-stained face, looking up in confusion. Marcus finally lifted his head from his hands, his bloodshot eyes staring at the phone. My mother uncrossed her arms, the smug satisfaction slowly melting off her face. Then what exactly happened, Donovan? My father demanded, his voice dropping into a low, threatening growl. Explain yourself right now. Last Thursday afternoon, a private equity trust executed a massive hostile takeover of our firm. Donovan explained, the words tumbling out of him in a frantic rush. It was completely under the radar. They bypassed the standard regulatory delays by purchasing the majority shares directly from our retiring board members through a blind trust. They acquired a 60% controlling interest in the company. We were completely bought out. My father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively at the phone. What does some corporate buyout have to do with Naomi? Did the new management clean house and lay her off? No, Harrison, you are still not getting it. Donovan practically sobbed. The trust that bought the company is called the Vanguard Apex Trust, and the sole managing director, the primary beneficiary, and the absolute owner of that trust is sitting right across the table from you. The silence that slammed into the private dining room was deafening. It was not just quiet, it was a complete suffocating vacuum of sound. Naomi is not my employee anymore. Harrison Donovan continued, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. She is the new chairman of the board. She owns 60% of this firm. She is my boss. You are sitting there threatening the woman who literally signs my paychecks and holds my entire career in the palm of her hand. I watched my father's brain short-circuit. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The heavy, intimidating patriarch of the Caldwell family had just been completely stripped of his ultimate weapon. The golf course connections, the country club, handshakes, the elite networking. He used to control everyone around him, had just been utterly obliterated by his own daughter. My mother looked like she had seen a ghost. Her jaw went slack, and all the color drained from her perfectly manicured face. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and profound disbelief. That is impossible, my father finally whispered, shaking his head in fierce denial. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. That is completely impossible, Donovan. She is just a senior strategist. She makes a good salary, but she does not have the kind of capital required to execute a corporate buyout of a major financial institution. She only has $336,000 to her name. We saw her bank records. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a rich, melodic sound that cut through their panic like a knife. I slowly stood up from my velvet chair. I walked calmly around the edge of the large mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I stopped right behind my father, resting my hands lightly on the back of his chair. He stiffened, completely frozen in place. You saw the decoy account, Dad, I said smoothly, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority. You saw the petty cash fund I deliberately left visible because I knew you and Mom were legally stalking my finances using that ancient power of attorney. I knew you would eventually try to drain it. So I gave you a shiny little object to focus on while I built an actual empire in the shadows. I walked past him and stood at the head of the table looking down at my family. For 11 years, you treated me like a workhorse, I explained, looking directly into my mother's terrified eyes. You forced me to take on extra consulting gigs, late night portfolios, and endless corporate strategy contracts just so I could pay off Marcus's debts and fund his fake billionaire lifestyle. You thought you were keeping me exhausted and subservient. You thought you were draining my resources so I could never rise above my designated station in this family. I turned my gaze to Chloe, who was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated awe and terror. The white privilege she had weaponized against me just 20 minutes ago had entirely evaporated. She suddenly realized she was not sitting across from a bitter single black woman. She was sitting across from a corporate titan who could buy and sell her entire family's old money estate before breakfast. But you made a fatal miscalculation, I continued, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers, while you were busy taking my liquid cash to buy Marcus his sports cars and his tropical vacations. You forced me to master the global financial markets. I took the scraps you left me, and I invested them perfectly. I built private equity portfolios. I leveraged international markets. I compounded my wealth inside untouchable trusts, while you were busy trying to maintain a fake image at your Sunday church service. I picked up my father's phone from the table. Donovan was still on the line, breathing heavily, absolutely terrified to speak. Donovan, I said, my voice crisp and commanding. Yes, Madam Chairman, Donovan replied instantly, his voice shaking with profound respect and fear. I want you to listen to me very carefully, I instructed. Harrison Caldwell is no longer a friend of this firm. If he or any member of his family attempts to contact you, your executives, or any of our partnered institutions, you are to immediately forward their communications to our legal department for harassment. Do you understand me? Yes, Madam Chairman, absolutely. Consider it done, Donovan stammered quickly. Have a good night, Donovan, I said. I pressed the red button ending the call and tossed the phone back onto the table in front of my father. My father stared at the blank screen of his phone, completely, utterly defeated. The man who had entered this restaurant feeling like a king was now sitting slumped in his chair, realizing he was entirely powerless. He had tried to execute me professionally, only to find out I owned the guillotine. My mother began to weep. It was not the theatrical, manipulative crying she used to get her way. It was a deep, guttural sobbing born from the absolute realization that she had completely lost control of the daughter she had abused for decades. Naomi, please, my mother choked out, reaching her trembling hands across the table toward me. You are so successful. You have so much. If you own a massive firm, you can easily pay off Marcus's $1.2 million debt. It would be nothing to you. You can save him. You can save our family. You do not have to let him go to prison. I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. They still did not understand. They still believed that because I had money, I owed it to them. They were so deeply infected by their own entitlement that they could not comprehend the concept of boundaries. I am not going to pay a single cent toward his fraudulent debt, I said, my tone completely final. I am not going to save him from the federal government. I am going to let him face the exact consequences of his own miserable, cheating, thieving actions. Marcus, who had been completely silent since his Ponzi scheme was exposed, finally looked up at me. His eyes were wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. He knew the FBI was currently tearing apart his father-in-law's estate. He knew his mistress's yacht was going to be seized. He knew he was going to federal prison. Naomi, please, Marcus begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You are my little sister. You have to help me. I will lose everything. I will lose my house. I slowly turned my attention fully to Marcus. A genuine bright smile spread across my face as I prepared to deliver the final, most devastating blow of the night. About that house, Marcus, I said cheerfully. I think it is time we discuss exactly how you were planning to pay for that $5 million mansion in Alpharetta. Marcus stared at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The terrified sweat on his forehead caught the warm light of the dining room chandelier. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the suffocating silence. What are you talking about, Naomi? He whispered, his voice trembling so badly he sounded like a frightened child. My broker approved the bridge loan for the Alpharetta property yesterday morning. We put down the earnest money. The financing is completely secure. I let out a soft, melodic laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. The sheer financial illiteracy of my older brother was truly something to behold. I slowly paced the length of the dining table, enjoying the way his panicked eyes followed my every move. Your broker did not approve that mansion because he believed in you, Marcus, I explained. He approved it because you pledged what you claimed were valuable ownership shares in your investment firm as collateral. On paper, those shares looked strong enough to support a bridge loan for the Alpharetta property. In reality, they were backed by fabricated statements from a company already collapsing under a $1.2 million margin call. Marcus stared at me without blinking. Chloe slowly turned toward him as she realized the house she had been bragging about all evening had never been financed by real wealth. And there is another detail you missed, I continued. The lending desk that underwrote that bridge facility sits inside the same financial institution whose controlling shares were acquired last week by the Vanguard Apex Trust. The firm Dad just called to have me fired. The firm I now control as chairman. When I purchased 60% of that company, I acquired the rights attached to its active credit portfolio, including the facility you used to secure your mansion. I stopped beside Marcus's chair and lowered my voice. So when you pledged those fake shares to get the house, you pledged them to my company. Marcus stopped breathing. Beside him, Chloe made a sharp, strangled sound. The $5 million mansion she had treated as proof of superiority was suddenly exposed as collateral inside a loan book I controlled. I straightened and looked at my father. Marcus could never have qualified on his own, could he, Dad? 5 years ago, when he launched his investment operation, he had no legitimate performance record and no capital strong enough to satisfy institutional underwriting. So you signed the guarantor package. You pledged your retirement accounts, vehicles, and family residence as secondary collateral because you were determined to make your son look successful before he had earned anything. My father's face turned gray. The patriarch who had spent the night ordering me to surrender my savings was gone. In his place sat a man realizing every signature he had placed beneath Marcus's name was now pointing back toward him. The documents were cross-collateralized, I continued. If Marcus performed, nobody touched your property. If he defaulted, the creditor could pursue the assets attached to the guarantee. You did not merely encourage his fantasy. You legally tied your own future to it. I turned the tablet so they could see the red notice glowing across the screen. And then Marcus made the final mistake tonight. That confirmation button was the digital acknowledgement attached to the pre-existing consolidated debt file. By using his biometric identity and confirming ownership, Marcus authenticated himself against the accounts he had spent months hiding behind shell entities. Marcus shook his head. No, that cannot transfer my house to you. I only logged into an account. Exactly, I said. You did not create the collateral tonight. Dad created it years ago. You did not create the bridge loan tonight. You signed it when you tried to buy the Alpharetta mansion. You did not create the margin debt tonight. Your fraudulent fund created it when the losses became impossible to hide. What you did tonight was connect your verified identity to the entire structure at the exact moment the system demanded confirmation. Your residence, your cars, the Alpharetta deposit, and the assets Harrison pledged as guarantor were already written into those agreements. And because the company holding the bridge facility is now controlled by me, every recovery right, triggered by your default, sits on my side of the table. I offered them a bright, ruthless smile. You tried to use an old power of attorney to take $336,000 from me. Instead, you authenticated the debt package that puts your mansion vehicles and Dad's pledged assets directly inside the recovery process of the company I own. The $1.2 million is due. You cannot pay it. The collateral is exposed. And for the first time in your life, Marcus, there is no woman at this table willing to sacrifice herself to make your numbers disappear. Chloe absolutely lost her mind. The heavy, suffocating blanket of her white privilege completely disintegrated, leaving her raw, exposed, and entirely vulnerable. She jumped up from her chair, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You cannot do this!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly in the private room. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess, and tears of pure, unadulterated panic streamed down her face. "You cannot just take our house. I am not paying for this. I had nothing to do with his fake business. My father will hire the most ruthless corporate litigators in the country, and we will bury you in court for years. We will have this entire agreement annulled." I looked at her with genuine pity. It was almost sad how desperately she clung to a safety net that no longer existed. Chloe, I said softly, shaking my head. Did you completely block out what I told you 5 minutes ago? Your father cannot hire anyone. His personal accounts are frozen. His business assets are currently being seized as evidence in a massive federal investigation because Marcus illegally funneled his money into offshore accounts. Your father is facing a mountain of federal indictments. He cannot save you. He cannot even save himself. You have absolutely nothing left. You are broke. Chloe staggered backward, hitting the wall. She slid down onto the carpet, pulling her knees to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. The arrogant woman who had sat at this very table just half an hour ago, demanding I hand over my life savings because I was a single black woman who needed to be useful, was now weeping on the floor of a steakhouse, stripped of her wealth, her status, and her pride. My father tried to summon one last pathetic surge of authority. He slammed his fist weakly against the table. "This is illegal, Naomi," he croaked out, his voice hoarse and trembling. "A simple click on an iPad application does not hold up in a court of law. You cannot execute an asset seizure without massive legal proceedings. We will fight you." "It holds up perfectly fine when it verifies a pre-existing federal lien." "Dad," I countered smoothly, completely unbothered by his empty threats. "You signed the original guarantor papers yourself 5 years ago in front of a notary. The legal framework was already set in stone. All I did was purchase the paper you signed. You built the trap. You set the bait. I simply walked in and closed the cage door." I reached down and picked up my designer clutch from the table. I checked my gold wristwatch, watching the second hand sweep precisely across the dial. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. I had spent the entire week coordinating this exact sequence of events with my legal team and the banking software automated systems. You see, I continued looking back up at my family. The beautiful thing about automated banking is that it does not care about your social status. It does not care about your country club memberships or your Sunday church reputation. When a massive default is confirmed on a high-risk margin account, the system triggers the recovery protocols immediately. It does not wait for Monday morning. I took a step back from the table, giving myself a perfect, unobstructed view of all three of them. "Right about now," I whispered. The silence in the room was abruptly shattered by a sharp, vibrating buzz. Marcus's smartphone lit up on the table. A notification chimed loudly. Before he could even reach for it, my father's phone buzzed in his suit pocket. A second later, Chloe's phone, sitting abandoned near her untouched martini, began to ring with a rapid, urgent tone. The sound of their devices ringing in unison was a terrifying symphony of their complete destruction. Marcus stared at his screen, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the device. The bright light of his phone illuminated the pure despair washing over his face. "Notice of asset seizure." Marcus read aloud, his voice completely hollow, stripped of all life and arrogance. "All associated accounts frozen pending federal review." My father slowly pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. He stared at the screen, his mouth falling open. "Foreclosure initiated." He breathed out the words, catching in his throat. "Residential property and retirement portfolios locked." Chloe did not even look at her phone. She just buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as she wailed on the floor. I stood there watching the empire of lies they had built over decades completely burn to ash in a matter of seconds. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They had treated me like a burden, a financial mule designed solely to carry the weight of their golden child's failures. They had invited me to this dinner specifically to break my spirit and steal my security. But as I looked at my brother staring blankly at his frozen accounts, my father clutching his chest as he lost his entire legacy, and my cruel sister-in-law weeping on the floor without a penny to her name, I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt a profound, beautiful sense of peace. They had tried to log into my bank account to take my life, but all they managed to do was log into their own permanent ruin. My mother, the woman who had spent nearly 3 decades terrorizing me into silent submission, finally broke. The polished, untouchable matriarch of the Caldwell family, completely shattered right in front of my eyes. Her knees gave, and she collapsed heavily onto the patterned carpet of the private dining room, completely ruining her expensive designer silk dress. She crawled toward me, her hands desperately reaching out to grab the hem of my tailored suit pants. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup, leaving dark, jagged streaks across her cheeks. "Naomi, I am begging you!" she sobbed, her voice, a pathetic broken wail that echoed loudly off the mahogany walls. "I will do anything you want. We will do anything you ask. Just release the debt. Do not take the house. Do not let them take everything we have built. He is your brother. He is your flesh and blood. You cannot do this to your own family." I looked down at her trembling hands, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no guilt, and certainly no love left in my heart for this woman. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her grasping hands to fall empty against the floor. "Flesh and blood did not stop you from trying to rob me of my life savings tonight," I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely void of emotion. "You set a trap for me. You sat at this table, smiled in my face, and tried to strip away my entire future just to buy your son another week of his fake billionaire fantasy. You made your choices, Vivian. Now you get to live in the reality you built." Violent cracks shattered the heavy air in the room. Chloe had marched over to Marcus, who was still sitting frozen in his chair, paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his fraudulent empire. With a scream of pure, unadulterated rage, Chloe struck him across the face with everything she had. The slap was so powerful it sounded like a gunshot. Marcus flinched violently, his head snapping to the side, a bright red handprint instantly forming on his cheek. "You lying, disgusting, pathetic parasite!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing at the seams. The carefully constructed facade of her refined, wealthy upbringing was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, ugly fury of a woman who realized she had been played for an absolute fool. "You used my family. You humiliated me in front of my father. You used my name to fund your disgusting double life with some cheap Miami mistress." She clawed frantically at her own finger, ripping off the massive custom-designed diamond engagement ring. It was the same ring my parents had secretly drained my college savings to help Marcus purchase. She hurled it directly at his face with terrifying force. The heavy diamond struck his cheekbone, leaving a small cut before clattering away and rolling under a serving cart in the corner of the room. "Do not ever look at me again," Chloe spat, backing away from him as if he were a highly infectious disease. "You are dead to me. My family's lawyers are going to tear you apart. We will leave you with absolutely nothing." But Chloe's lawyers were not going to get the chance to touch him. Before Marcus could even process the physical blow from his wife, before he could formulate a single pathetic excuse to defend his shattered pride, the heavy oak doors of our private dining room swung open. They did not open politely. They were pushed wide open with absolute, undeniable authority. Everyone in the room instantly froze. It was not the restaurant manager coming to check on the noise. It was not a waiter bringing the dessert course. 3 men and 1 woman walked into the room. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits, their expressions strictly business, entirely unbothered by the dramatic scene unfolding before them. Bright gold federal badges were prominently clipped to their belts, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. My father, driven by pure instinct and decades of arrogant country club bravado, tried to step forward to manage the situation. "Excuse me, gentlemen, this is a highly private family dinner," my father stammered, holding up his hands in a desperate attempt to assert control. "You cannot just barge in here. I know the chief of police in this city." The lead agent did not even look at him. He completely ignored my father's existence, walking straight past him, bypassing the spilled wine and the shattered crystal on the floor. He marched directly toward my brother, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Marcus Caldwell," the lead agent announced, his voice deep, booming, and completely void of any negotiation. "You are under federal arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering." Marcus let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp. He tried to push his chair back, perhaps instinctively trying to run, but his legs completely failed him. The sheer gravity of the moment crushed the remaining breath out of his lungs. 2 federal agents flanked him instantly. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his extremely expensive tailored suit jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet. They spun him around, slamming his hands firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of my freedom. It was the sound of 29 years of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and toxic family manipulation, finally coming to a permanent, irreversible end. You have the right to remain silent. The agent continued reading. Marcus his Miranda rights as they forcefully marched him toward the door. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. My mother let out a blood-curdling scream, burying her face into the restaurant carpet, completely incapable of watching her precious golden child being treated like a common criminal. My father collapsed backward into his dining chair. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, fully realizing that his son was going to federal prison, his wealth was entirely seized, and his social standing in Atlanta was permanently annihilated. He was a ruined man, left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his own greed. Chloe pressed herself against the far wall of the room, her eyes wide with terror, suddenly realizing that as Marcus's legal spouse, the federal investigation was going to inevitably rip through her own bank accounts by tomorrow morning. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply stood at the head of the table, perfectly composed in my burgundy suit. As the federal agents dragged my sobbing, completely broken brother past me toward the exit, I reached out and calmly picked up my glass of vintage red wine. Marcus lifted his head, his tear-streaked, terrified face turning to look at me one last time. He looked exactly like the pathetic, hollow fraud he truly was. I held his gaze. I offered him a slow, radiant smile, lifting my wine glass into the air. I tilted it slightly toward him in a silent, mocking toast, celebrating his absolute downfall and my ultimate victory. I took a slow sip of the wine as they hauled him out the door. It tasted absolutely incredible. The fallout of that night at the steakhouse did not just make local financial news. It sent absolute catastrophic shockwaves through the wealthy elite circles of Atlanta. For 30 years, my parents had meticulously built an empire entirely out of sand, held together by nothing but arrogance, fake smiles, and my stolen labor. Now the tide had finally come in, and I had a front row seat to watch every single grain wash away. In the high-stakes world of generational wealth, reputation is the only currency that truly matters. Once word spread that Harrison Caldwell had directly guaranteed a fraudulent Ponzi scheme that robbed his own friends, his social execution was swift and merciless. Less than 48 hours after Marcus was hauled away in handcuffs, my father received a hand-delivered courier letter from his prestigious country club. The board of directors, a group composed of the very men my father used to play golf with, every Saturday voted unanimously to permanently revoke his membership. When he desperately drove down to the club to demand an explanation, the private security guards refused to even let his car pass the front gates. The man who had threatened to destroy my career using his elite connections was now officially a pariah, completely exiled from the only world he cared about. My mother's social destruction was even more poetic. Vivian Caldwell had spent her entire adult life sitting in the front pew of the most prominent black megachurch in the city. She used her position to look down on everyone gossiping about other families and judging anyone who did not meet her impossible, hypocritical standards. But Marcus had not just stolen from billionaire investors like Chloe's father. He had also taken massive investments from the prominent families in that exact church congregation. When Sunday morning arrived, my mother tried to walk into the sanctuary with her head held high, completely steeped in denial, expecting her fellow churchgoers to offer her pity and grace. Instead, she was met with a wall of absolute silence and disgust. The families whose retirement funds had been liquidated to buy Marcus's mistress a yacht simply stood up and walked away when she approached. The pastor politely but firmly asked her to step down from all her committee positions. She was completely shunned by the very community she had spent decades trying to impress. Without their social shield, the financial reality crushed them with terrifying speed. Because I held the consolidated debt portfolio, and because Marcus's margin call was a matter of federal record, the asset seizure protocols moved faster than my father's lawyers could even attempt to file a motion to delay. Within 60 days, the bank officially foreclosed on their sprawling custom-built estate. I was not there to see it in person, but I did not need to be. The financial reports crossed my desk every morning. I knew the exact day the moving trucks arrived. My parents were forced to liquidate everything of value just to keep a roof over their heads. My father had to sell his collection of vintage luxury cars to a wholesale dealership for a fraction of their worth. My mother had to auction off her heavy diamond jewelry, her designer handbags, and the imported antique furniture she used to brag about at dinner parties. They watched their entire life's work get boxed up and sold off to the highest bidder to cover a fraction of the massive debt their golden child had accumulated. With their wealth entirely evaporated, Harrison and Vivian Caldwell were forced to move into a cramped, poorly maintained two-bedroom apartment in a rundown suburb far outside the Atlanta city limits. It was the exact type of neighborhood my mother used to sneer at when we drove past it in her luxury SUV. Now she was forced to listen to her upstairs neighbors pacing through the thin ceiling while my father had to park a cheap 15-year-old used sedan in an unsecured outdoor parking lot. They had to learn how to shop with coupons. They had to learn how to budget for electricity and water. They were finally experiencing the exact financial terror they had happily subjected me to for my entire 20s. And the worst part for them was that it was all entirely in vain. Every single penny they scraped together from selling off their elite lifestyle went directly to a team of criminal defense attorneys for Marcus. But even the best lawyers in Georgia could not save a man who had left a massive, easily traceable digital footprint of wire fraud and money laundering. As the federal prosecutors built their ironclad case, the expensive private attorneys demanded higher retainers. When my parents could no longer afford the exorbitant legal fees, the elite defense team dropped Marcus as a client. The beloved, brilliant golden boy of the Caldwell family was ultimately assigned an overworked public defender to face a judge for crimes that carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in federal prison. They had sacrificed their daughter, their home, their wealth, and their entire legacy to protect a son who was completely doomed from the start. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a custom leather chair in the corner office of the top floor of an Atlanta high-rise. The panoramic glass windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, a city I now owned a significant piece of. As the new chairman of the board, I spent my days restructuring the firm, expanding our private equity reach, and securing multi-million-dollar international contracts. My office was quiet, secure, and completely impenetrable. I had built an absolute fortress of success, and no one from my past was allowed inside. But that did not stop my mother from trying. As the reality of her miserable, impoverished new life truly settled in, her sheer desperation overrode whatever tiny shred of pride she had left. Vivian realized that the daughter she had thrown away was now a corporate titan holding the exact wealth and power she was desperately starving for. Every single morning, precisely at 9 o'clock, the phone on my executive assistant's desk would ring. It was always my mother, and she always used the exact same tired, manipulative tactics she had relied on her entire life. She tried to bypass my corporate firewall by weaponizing the concept of family, desperately hoping that somewhere deep down I was still the little girl who just wanted her mother to love her. "Please, you have to put me through to Naomi." My mother would beg, her voice thick with highly practiced theatrical tears. "I am her mother. I gave birth to her. She needs to speak to me. Her father is having blood pressure issues from this stress, and Marcus's trial is coming up. We are family. God tells us to forgive our family. Tell her I love her. Tell her we just need a little bit of help to get back on our feet." But my mother completely failed to understand that the corporate security protocols I had installed were absolutely absolute. I had hired a team of highly trained professionals whose sole job was to protect my time, my energy, and my peace of mind. My executive assistant, a sharp, fiercely loyal woman named Sarah, never wavered. She would listen to my mother's sobbing performance with complete professional detachment. She did not offer sympathy. She did not offer excuses. "I am sorry, ma'am," Sarah would reply, her voice crisp and completely emotionless. "Madam Chairman has explicitly instructed security that she does not have any family matching your description. Your number has been flagged for harassment. If you continue to call this corporate office, our legal department will file a restraining order before the end of the business day. Do not call this line again." And then Sarah would hang up the phone. She would drop the receiver back into the cradle, cutting off my mother's frantic begging with a sharp, definitive click. I would sit in my office reviewing quarterly profit margins, completely unbothered by the fact that the woman who had abused me for decades was crying on the other side of the city. She was entirely locked out of my universe. She had absolutely zero power to manipulate my emotions, zero access to my wealth, and zero ability to inflict any more pain upon my life. She was screaming into a void, and the void was hanging up on her every single day. While my parents were busy learning how to navigate life at the bottom of the social ladder, my former sister-in-law was discovering that her precious white privilege was not the impenetrable shield she always believed it to be. Chloe had assumed she could simply wash her hands of Marcus sign the expedited divorce papers and retreat safely into the luxurious fortress of her father's sprawling estate. She genuinely thought she could cry her way out of the scandal, play the innocent, victimized wife for the local media, and wait for her father's old money connections to smooth everything over. But federal investigators do not care about country club tears, and they certainly do not care about Atlanta high society. When the Securities and Exchange Commission audited her father's massive investment firm, they found the exact paper trail I knew was hiding there. Her father had not just been a naive, innocent victim of my brother's Ponzi scheme. He had been an active, willing participant. The audit revealed that he had knowingly funneled his own clients' money into Marcus's fraudulent crypto accounts in exchange for massive, illegal, untaxed kickbacks. I was officially indicted just 3 weeks after Marcus was arrested. The federal government immediately froze everything. They seized his sprawling mansions, his offshore accounts, his luxury vehicles, and most importantly, they seized Chloe's supposedly untouchable generational trust funds. Overnight, the haughty, arrogant heiress who had sneered at my hard work was reduced to absolutely nothing. Her credit cards declined at her favorite salons. Her elite friends stopped returning her text messages. The wealthy social circle that had defined her entire existence dropped her with a breathtaking, ruthless speed. For the first time in her 28 years of life, Chloe was forced to actually look for a job. With a completely useless art history degree she had barely earned and absolutely zero real-world work experience, the corporate world rejected her applications instantly. The woman who had proudly told me that people like me belonged at the bottom of the hierarchy was suddenly facing a terrifying reality check. She had to learn how to write a resume. She had to learn how to budget for cheap groceries. She had to learn how to survive in the exact world she had spent her entire life mocking. I found out exactly where she ended up about 4 months later. I was spending my Saturday afternoon shopping at Phipps Plaza, the most exclusive luxury mall in the city. I had just closed a highly lucrative international acquisition deal for my firm, and I decided to treat myself to a new custom leather handbag. I walked into one of the most high-end designer boutiques in the plaza. The store was immaculate, smelling of rich leather and expensive floral perfumes. I was browsing a display of limited edition bags when I noticed a retail employee on her knees near the back of the store, frantically trying to pick up a dropped stack of inventory receipts. She was wearing the standard required black polyester uniform of the sales staff. When she stood up and brushed her hair out of her face, we locked eyes. It was Chloe. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking completely pale and sickly under the bright retail lights. Her shoulders slumped and her eyes darted wildly toward the back room, looking like she desperately wanted to run away and hide. But the store manager was standing just a few feet away, watching the sales floor like a hawk. Chloe had a job to keep. She had rent to pay. She could not afford to run away. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply maintained a calm, perfectly composed expression. I picked up a stunning, deep emerald green leather tote bag from the display, the price tag clearly marking it at $4,500. I held it casually in my hand and walked directly over to the checkout counter where Chloe was standing. She backed up slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the glass counter. Her knuckles were white. She looked down at the register, completely refusing to make eye contact with me. "I would like to purchase this, please," I said, my voice smooth and polite. Chloe swallowed hard. Her hands shook violently as she reached out to take the handbag from me. She fumbled with the scanner, dropping the price tag twice before she finally managed to scan the barcode. The machine beeped loudly. "That will be $4,815 with tax," Chloe whispered. Her voice was incredibly small. completely stripped of the arrogant, aggressive tone she had used against me in the private dining room. I reached into my purse and pulled out my heavy black titanium corporate card. I slid it across the glass counter, stopping it right in front of her. It was the exact same card connected to the exact same wealth she had tried to steal from me just a few months ago. Chloe picked up the card. I watched a single tear escape her eye and trace a line down her cheek as she inserted the chip into the payment terminal. She was forced to stand there and personally process a transaction for a handbag that cost more than she now made in an entire month of exhausting retail work. She had to swallow every single ounce of her pride, her racism, and her unearned superiority to provide customer service to the black woman she had sworn to destroy. The terminal chimed, approving the massive transaction instantly. She pulled the card out and handed it back to me along with a printed receipt. "Would you like me to bag this for you?" Chloe asked, her voice cracking with absolute humiliation. "Yes, please," I replied evenly. She carefully folded the expensive tissue paper, placed the bag inside a heavy branded shopping tote, and tied it with a perfect silk ribbon. She pushed the bag across the counter toward me. She finally forced herself to look up, her red tear-filled eyes meeting mine. I picked up the shopping bag. I did not throw her past insults in her face. I did not need to remind her that she had once told me I should be grateful her family had elevated my name. The profound, undeniable reality of our current situation was screaming louder than any words I could possibly say. I looked at the woman who had tried to ruin my life, seeing nothing but a broken, exhausted retail worker facing a long, difficult shift. "Keep the receipt, Chloe," I said softly. "Have a good shift." I turned around and walked out of the luxury boutique, the click of my heels echoing off the polished marble floors of the mall. I did not look back. I stepped out into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute sovereignty. Her delusions of superiority had been entirely crushed by reality, and I had a beautiful new bag to carry back to my corner office. A few weeks after that profoundly satisfying afternoon at the luxury boutique, the final remnants of my former family were swept away completely. My life had settled into a beautiful, uninterrupted rhythm of absolute peace and undeniable corporate success. I was standing in my expansive corner office on the top floor of the Apex building, a space I had designed to reflect the exact opposite of the chaotic, toxic environment I grew up in. The walls were painted a deep, calming charcoal. The furniture was sleek and modern, and the massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unbothered view of the bustling Atlanta streets below. I was standing by my custom mahogany bookshelf, running my fingers over the spines of financial strategy volumes, when my executive assistant Sarah walked into the room. She was carrying the morning stack of sorted mail, holding one particular envelope slightly apart from the rest. She stopped just inside the doorway, her expression a mixture of professional neutrality and subtle concern. "Madam Chairman," Sarah said quietly, her voice pulling my attention away from the skyline. "All the standard correspondence has been routed to the appropriate department heads. However, this one bypassed the usual corporate screening because it was addressed to you personally, marked as urgent and privileged legal correspondence. I thought you should see it before security shreds it." She walked across the plush carpet and handed me a standard, cheap white envelope. It was entirely different from the thick embossed stationery that usually crossed my desk. The paper was thin and flimsy, but it was the return address stamped in bold black ink in the upper left corner that caught my immediate attention. It was from a federal correctional institution. Right below the printed seal was a handwritten name and a freshly assigned inmate identification number. It was from Marcus. I took the envelope from Sarah, thanking her quietly, and waited for the heavy glass door of my office to click shut behind her. I walked over to my desk and sat down in my leather executive chair. For a brief moment, I simply stared at the shaky, frantic handwriting spelling out my name. A year ago, holding a letter like this would have sent me into a blind panic. My heart would have raced, my palms would have sweat, and I would have been instantly consumed by a crushing manufactured sense of guilt. I would have felt the overwhelming programmed urge to drop everything, empty my bank accounts, and rush to save my older brother from the consequences of his own disastrous actions. That was the response my parents had brutally conditioned into me since I was a child. But as I slid a silver letter opener through the top of the envelope, my heart rate did not increase by a single beat. My hands were perfectly steady. I pulled out 3 sheets of lined yellow legal paper covered edge to edge in frantic, desperate scribbles. Naomi, please, you have to read this. The letter began abandoning every trace of pride. I am begging you. The detention hearing went against me, and my court-appointed lawyer says the judge will only reconsider release if I can present a secured bond package and private counsel prepared to supervise the conditions. I need you to post the bail money and fund the retainer. I cannot stay locked in here while the prosecutors build this case around me. I am terrified, Naomi. I cannot sleep. I keep thinking about what happens if I go into trial from a cell with no resources and no one fighting for me. You have the capital. You have the connections. Please put up the bond and hire the lawyers before it is too late. I leaned back in my chair, reading the words with a cold, clinical detachment. He was not writing to apologize for running a fraudulent Ponzi scheme. I was not writing to express any genuine remorse for destroying the life savings of innocent families in our community. He was certainly not apologizing for attempting to steal my $336,000 to fund his mistress and his yacht. He was only writing because he was scared, and because he still viewed me as his personal, unlimited bank account. He continued his pathetic plea by attempting to weaponize our shared history, deploying the exact same emotional manipulation tactics my mother had used for decades. We are blood, Naomi. Marcus wrote his desperation bleeding through the ink. We grew up in the same house. You cannot leave your only brother sitting in detention when one transfer from you could get me home while the case is pending. Mom and Dad are living in absolute squalor. They have lost everything because of this, and their health is failing. If you refuse to help me, the stress will destroy them, and you will have to live with that. You proved your point. You won. You are the successful one now. Be the bigger person. Put up the bond, retain the private legal team, and give me a chance to fight this from outside these walls. I swear I will repay every cent when this nightmare is over. I finished reading the last frantic paragraph and placed the yellow papers gently onto the pristine surface of my glass desk. The concept of being the bigger person is perhaps the most toxic, destructive lie ever sold to survivors of family abuse. It is a deeply manipulative phrase designed entirely to protect the abuser from facing the natural consequences of their actions. Throughout the Black community, and especially within affluent circles that prioritize reputation above all else, there is an incredibly heavy unspoken expectation placed on successful women. We are expected to carry the burdens of our broken, toxic male relatives. We are expected to endure their disrespect, finance their failures, and endlessly forgive their betrayals, all under the sacred, unquestionable banner of family loyalty. For weeks leading up to this moment, several distant aunts and older church members had managed to track down my corporate email address. They flooded my inbox with unsolicited advice, demanding that I forgive my parents and bail my brother out of jail. They told me that holding a grudge was a poison that would ruin my spirit. They warned me that God would not bless my wealth if I turned my back on my own flesh and blood. They tried to wrap their toxic enablement in the language of faith and grace. But true forgiveness does not mean handing a loaded gun back to the person who just tried to shoot you. True forgiveness is making peace with the fact that the relationship is permanently dead and refusing to carry the anger with you into your new life. What my family and their enablers were demanding was not forgiveness. They were demanding submission. They wanted me to willingly step back into my assigned role as the sacrificial lamb so they could all feel comfortable again. I looked down at the letter. I did not feel the urge to rip it into pieces. Ripping it up would have been an act of anger, and anger would imply that Marcus still held some sort of emotional power over me. Anger would mean that his words still had the capacity to hurt my feelings. But I felt absolutely nothing for the man who wrote this letter. He was a complete stranger, a fraud who had tried to rob me blind and failed spectacularly. Instead of throwing the pages into the shredder, I stood up from my desk and walked over to a secure filing cabinet in the corner of my office. I unlocked the heavy metal drawer and pulled out a beautifully crafted custom mahogany display frame I had ordered specifically for this occasion. I carried the frame back to my desk. Inside the glass casing taking up the left side of the display was the original yellow general power of attorney document. The exact same piece of paper my father had aggressively thrown onto the dining table at the Buckhead Steakhouse. The weapon they had tried to use to completely drain my life savings and destroy my future. I took the 3 pages of Marcus's desperate, pathetic prison letter and carefully arranged them on the right side of the display frame, positioning them perfectly parallel to the power of attorney document. I locked the back of the mahogany frame, securing both documents behind the thick ultraviolet protective glass. I walked over to the prominent wall right next to my office door and hung the heavy frame on a secure brass hook. I stepped back, admiring how the dark wood contrasted perfectly against the charcoal paint. It was not a trophy. It was a permanent daily reminder. It was a monument to the absolute necessity of strict, unbreakable boundaries. Every time I walked into my office to make massive financial decisions, every time I sat down to negotiate international corporate acquisitions, I would see that frame. It would serve as a constant reminder that I must never, under any circumstances, allow the manipulation of shared genetics to override my instinct for self-preservation. It was visual proof that toxic loyalty will drain your bank account and ruin your life if you do not have the courage to cut the cord. I walked back to my desk and pressed the intercom button to connect with my assistant. "Sarah," I said smoothly. "Yes, Madam Chairman." Her voice crackled back instantly. "I need you to prepare a package to be sent out in the afternoon mail," I instructed. "It needs to be shipped directly to the Federal Correctional Facility in Atlanta, addressed to inmate number 8472919. "Right away," Sarah replied. "Shall I contact the legal department to arrange a transfer of funds or draft a response letter on your behalf?" "No funds and no letter." I said, a faint smile touching my lips. "Just a book. Please go down to the corporate training library on the 4th floor and pull a copy of our introductory manual, the one titled Principles of Corporate Integrity and Financial Ethics. Pack it securely and ship it via standard mail." "Understood perfectly," Madam Chairman, Sarah said, a hint of professional amusement detectable in her voice. "I will have it sent out within the hour." I released the intercom button and leaned back in my leather chair. I turned my chair to face the massive windows looking out over the sprawling, sunlit metropolis of Atlanta. The city was moving, buzzing with industry and life, completely indifferent to the shattered egos of the Caldwell family. I had given Marcus everything he actually needed. He did not need me to post his bond, rescue him from detention, or buy him another shield from consequences. He needed to learn the basic principles of honesty, integrity, and accountability. Whether he spent the coming months awaiting trial or the years after judgment behind federal walls, he would finally have time to study the rules he had spent his entire adult life believing were meant only for other people. I took a deep breath, inhaling the quiet, expensive scent of my secure office. The air was entirely free of manipulation, free of guilt, and entirely free of the people who had tried to drag me down to their miserable level. I had successfully severed the infected limbs of my family tree, and in doing so, I had saved my own life. I turned back to my desk, opened my laptop, and began reviewing the next quarter's profit margins, ready to conquer the day. The days that followed that definitive moment in my office blurred into weeks, and those weeks blossomed into the most magnificent, uninterrupted years of my entire existence. I was no longer just surviving the crushing weight of my family. I was completely dominating the financial landscape of Atlanta. The Vanguard Apex Trust did not just grow under my direct leadership. It became an absolute behemoth in the private equity sector. I spent my mornings commanding executive boardrooms, completely free from the suffocating shadow of Harrison Caldwell. I acquired prime commercial real estate, funded cutting-edge green energy initiatives, and secured multi-million-dollar international contracts that solidified my reputation as one of the most ruthless and brilliant financial strategists in the country. The corporate world respected me, my competitors feared me, and my bank accounts reflected a level of generational wealth that my parents could never have achieved in 100 lifetimes. But as I watched my net worth climb into the hundreds of millions, a profound realization settled over me. Wealth for the sheer sake of wealth was exactly what had destroyed my parents. They had worshipped money, using it to buy fake status and control the people around them. I knew that hoarding capital without a genuine uplifting purpose was just a different kind of prison. I refused to let my empire become a cold, empty monument to corporate greed. I wanted to use my resources to actively dismantle the exact toxic systems that had tried to keep me trapped at the bottom. This realization birthed my proudest professional achievement. I established a specialized venture capital branch within my firm and named it the Sovereign Genesis Initiative. It was a massive, fully funded investment vehicle operating entirely under my direct supervision. Its sole purpose was to identify, fund, and aggressively elevate businesses founded by brilliant Black women. In our community, the expectation for highly successful women to act as the permanent financial mules for their struggling, entitled relatives is a quiet, devastating epidemic. We are systematically taught from a very young age to shrink our ambitions, to empty our pockets, and to willingly sacrifice our own stability on the altar of family loyalty. We are told that if we make it out of poverty, it is our unquestionable duty to drag everyone else up with us, even if those people are actively trying to drown us. I had lived that nightmare for 29 years. I knew exactly how it felt to work 80-hour weeks, only to have your own parents demand your life savings to cover a golden child's reckless mistakes. I designed the Sovereign Genesis Initiative to be an impenetrable shield for women who were trapped exactly where I used to be. I did not just want to hand them corporate funding. I wanted to hand them absolute, irrevocable freedom. I will never forget the morning a young woman named Maya walked into my office to pitch her tech startup. She was 26 years old, exhausted, and carrying the heavy, familiar posture of a woman carrying way too much weight on her shoulders. She had developed a revolutionary logistics algorithm that was practically guaranteed to disrupt the shipping industry. Her business model was flawless. But as I looked across my glass desk, I saw the dark circles under her eyes. I saw the way her hands trembled slightly when she handed me her financial projections. During our conversation, the truth finally spilled out. Maya was on the verge of total personal bankruptcy. Despite her brilliant mind, she was secretly draining her startup capital to pay off her father's massive gambling debts and fund her older brother's failing legal defense. Her family was holding her hostage, with guilt threatening to publicly shame her at their church if she did not hand over the money she had secured from early investors. She was sitting in my office, terrified, believing she had to choose between her groundbreaking career and her family's love. I looked at Maya and saw an exact mirror image of my former self. I leaned across my desk, folded my hands, and stopped her presentation. I did not just give Maya a $2 million seed round that day. I gave her my entire corporate legal team. I had my top attorneys meticulously untangle her business assets from her family's grasp. I personally mentored her on the absolute necessity of establishing titanium boundaries. I taught her how to legally freeze out relatives who viewed her as a communal bank account. I showed her that walking away from toxic blood ties does not make you a villain. It makes you a survivor. Watching Maya ring the opening bell at the stock exchange, when her company went public 3 years later, was a million times more satisfying than any luxury purchase I had ever made for myself. The Sovereign Genesis Initiative did much more than generate massive financial returns for my firm. It built an incredible, unbreakable community. It created a sisterhood of fiercely intelligent, utterly unstoppable women who understood the exact price of their freedom. We did not share any DNA, but we shared something significantly more powerful. We shared mutual respect, unyielding support, and absolute integrity. I had spent my entire childhood feeling completely alone in a house full of people. Now I was surrounded by a chosen family that actively nourished my spirit. My penthouse in Midtown Atlanta became our designated sanctuary. I completely replaced the traumatic memory of that blood-soaked toxic steakhouse dinner with evenings filled with genuine, vibrant joy. At least once a month, I host massive, lavish dinners for my inner circle. The massive marble dining table in my home would be overflowing with rich, soulful food prepared by top private chefs. Sarah, my brilliant former executive assistant, who I had promoted to my chief of operations, would be there pouring expensive vintage wine and sharing stories about our latest corporate conquests. Maya would be standing by the panoramic windows laughing loudly with other successful founders I had mentored. The air was always filled with the sound of R&B music and the beautiful noise of women celebrating each other's victories without a single ounce of jealousy or hidden agendas. There were no passive-aggressive insults hurled across my table. There were no demands for my banking passwords or threats of disownment. There was no Chloe sitting in the corner, weaponizing her white privilege to make us feel small, and there was absolutely no Marcus expecting to be worshipped simply for existing. My home was a space completely sterilized of manipulation. I had completely redefined the word family for myself. I learned the hard way that true family does not constantly drain your spirit or demand your life savings as proof of your love. True family celebrates your boundaries. They protect your peace. They applaud your success instead of trying to steal the credit for it. As I stood on my sprawling balcony one warm summer evening, listening to the beautiful, unfiltered laughter of the women I had helped elevate, I looked out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city lights stretched out for miles in every direction, vibrant and alive. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the cool night breeze wash over my face. I had not just built a corporate empire that dominated the financial sector. I had built a fortress of absolute joy and security. I had taken the shattered, manipulated pieces of my past, the pain of being the unloved workhorse, the trauma of my parents' epic betrayal, and I had forged them all into a heavy, unbreakable crown. Standing on that balcony, I understood that the most expensive thing I had ever purchased was not a building a company or a piece of equity. It was distance. Distance from people who believed access to me was their birthright. Distance from voices that could turn a family dinner into an audit of my obedience. Distance from the old version of myself who confused being needed with being loved. For years, I thought boundaries were walls built by angry people. I had been taught that a good daughter answered every call solved, every emergency opened every account, and absorbed every consequence. My family called that loyalty. In reality, it was a system designed to keep me permanently available for extraction. That lesson changed the way I looked at every relationship in my life. A boundary was not revenge. It was not punishment. It was simply a clear statement of where my responsibility ended and another adult's responsibility began. If someone could only remain close to me while I was paying their bills, fixing their scandals, swallowing their insults, or surrendering my peace, then closeness was never what they wanted. They wanted access. The distinction was brutal, but once I understood it, I could never unsee it. I used to believe saying no required a courtroom argument. I thought I had to prove that my reasons were reasonable enough, compassionate enough, or morally pure enough before the people around me would accept them. That belief kept me trapped. Manipulative people do not ask for explanations because they want clarity. They ask for explanations because every additional sentence gives them another handle to grab. My parents had turned every explanation I ever offered into a negotiation. If I said I was tired, they reminded me Marcus was under pressure. If I said I needed to save, they accused me of being selfish. If I said I felt disrespected, they called me sensitive. There was always a counter-argument because they never intended to respect the answer. So I learned to make my boundaries shorter. No, I am not paying for that. No, I am not signing that. No, you may not speak to me that way. No, you may not enter my office. No, you do not have access to my accounts. No explanation large enough to be cross-examined. No emotional opening wide enough to be converted into guilt. That simplicity felt almost unnatural at first. Then it felt like oxygen. Financial boundaries became especially sacred to me because money had been the language my family used to measure love. They taught me that generosity meant surrender. They treated every dollar I earned as evidence that I could afford one more sacrifice. But real generosity is voluntary. It cannot survive coercion. The moment someone uses fear, shame, blood, religion, reputation, or obligation to force money out of you, the transaction stops being generosity and becomes control. I began teaching the women I worked with to protect their financial lives with the same seriousness they protected their physical safety. Separate accounts, independent legal advice, written agreements, No shared passwords out of guilt. No signatures on documents that have not been read line by line. No loans made because a relative is screaming that the family will collapse without them. No secret debt absorbed to preserve somebody else's image. I did not teach those principles because I wanted everyone to become cold. I taught them because love without structure is easy for predators to imitate. The framed power of attorney in my office became the clearest symbol of that truth. At 18, I had signed it because I believed obedience was proof of trust. At 29, my parents carried that same paper into a steakhouse, believing it was still a key to my life. They never noticed that the person who had signed it had changed. I had learned how contracts worked. I had learned how leverage worked. Most importantly, I had learned that adulthood meant I was allowed to revoke access to people who had once been granted it. That realization reached far beyond money. I stopped answering questions that were really accusations. I stopped attending gatherings where my presence was required only so someone else could humiliate me publicly. I stopped treating every family emergency as my personal assignment. I stopped apologizing for succeeding in ways that made insecure people uncomfortable. I stopped making myself smaller so someone else could continue pretending they were bigger. There was grief in that freedom. I will never pretend otherwise. Cutting off toxic relatives did not erase the childhood memories I wanted to keep. It did not erase the small moments when I had once hoped my mother would choose me, when I waited for my father to say he was proud, when I believed Marcus might someday become the protective older brother I needed. Boundaries did not rewrite the past. They forced me to accept that some of the future I had imagined would never exist. But grief was not a reason to reopen the door. That was another lesson I had to learn. Missing what a relationship should have been is not the same as being safe inside the relationship that actually exists. I could mourn the mother I wanted without giving Vivian access to my office. I could mourn the father I deserved without answering Harrison's demands. I could remember being a little sister without funding Marcus's freedom. Compassion did not require surrender. The difference between relatives and family became painfully simple. Relatives can share your name, your history, your features, your memories, and your blood. Family is built through behavior. Family respects a no without punishing you. Family can hear good news without turning it into a competition. Family can watch you succeed without calculating what percentage belongs to them. Family does not need your failure in order to feel secure. That was why the people around my table now felt more like family than anyone who had sat across from me at the Buckhead Steakhouse. They did not need passwords. They did not need ownership. They did not need me weak. They could celebrate the woman I had become without demanding repayment for the privilege of knowing me. That kind of peace was unfamiliar, and then it became normal. Once peace becomes normal, chaos loses its ability to masquerade as love. I also stopped confusing forgiveness with reunion. I did not wake up every morning plotting ways to hurt my parents. I did not spend my evenings imagining Marcus suffering in a cell. Their punishment was no longer the center of my life. That was precisely why I was free. Revenge had started as the decision to stop them from taking what belonged to me. It ended when I realized I no longer needed to watch them lose in order to know I had won. The sweetest revenge was not the foreclosure notice. It was not the FBI handcuffs. It was not seeing Chloe behind a retail counter or hearing that my parents had been rejected by the social circles they once worshipped. Those moments were consequences, and I will never pretend I felt sorry for them. But consequences were still tied to their lives. My real victory was building a life where their next decision could not change my morning. If Vivian called, security handled it. If Harrison complained, my attorneys handled it. If Marcus wrote from detention, the mailroom handled it. Their chaos no longer traveled directly into my nervous system. I no longer lost sleep because one of them was angry. I no longer checked my account balances in fear that someone had found another way inside. I no longer walked into a room bracing for the next insult. Their power ended not when they became poor, but when I stopped organizing my emotions around their approval. That was the lesson I wished I could place directly into the hands of every person who had ever been called selfish for protecting themselves. You are not required to bankrupt your future to prove you remember your past. You are not required to remain reachable to people who use every conversation as an opportunity to manipulate you. You are not required to keep a seat at your table for someone who repeatedly arrives with a knife. And financial independence is not only about becoming rich, it is about preserving choice. It is knowing that your rent, food, healthcare, transportation, and future are not controlled by the person demanding your obedience. It is keeping enough of yourself that a threat to withdraw love does not automatically become a threat to your survival. Money cannot create healthy relationships, but financial dependence can trap people inside unhealthy ones for years. I had spent my 20s believing I was building savings. In reality, I was building an exit. Every late night, every extra contract, every investment I made after my family took its share gave me one more inch of ground they could not control. They thought my discipline made me useful to them. Eventually, that same discipline made me unreachable. Years after the steakhouse, I could sit alone in my office and look at that framed power of attorney without feeling rage. That was how I knew the wound had finally closed. The document had not changed. My memory of the night had not changed. What changed was the amount of authority I gave it. It was no longer evidence that my family had almost destroyed me. It was evidence that access can be revoked, contracts can be challenged, patterns can be broken, and a woman who has been trained to surrender can learn to own every decision that follows. On the final evening of the story, I am telling you now, I sat alone on the sofa in my midtown penthouse with a glass of red wine resting lightly in my hand. The city spread beyond the windows in layers of gold and white. I could see offices still glowing, headlights moving through the streets, cranes standing over new construction, thousands of lives continuing without any knowledge of the private war that had once consumed mine. The camera would not need to rush. It could move slowly, pulling back as I looked across the skyline. There was no one pounding on my door, no one demanding a password, no one waving an old legal document in my face, no one telling me my value depended on what I could provide for Marcus. The silence in that room was not loneliness. It was ownership. I thought back to the beginning, to the moment Harrison threw that yellowed power of attorney onto the table as if he were presenting a death sentence. He believed the paper proved he still had authority over the 18-year-old girl I used to be. Vivian believed motherhood gave her permanent access to my money. Marcus believed being the golden child meant consequences could always be transferred to me. Chloe believed race, wealth, marriage, and social status placed her permanently above me. Every one of them made the same mistake. They confused my patience with weakness. They confused my previous sacrifices with consent to future exploitation. They confused the fact that I loved them with the belief that I would never leave them. I had wanted their love so badly that for years I accepted deals no competent strategist would ever advise a client to sign. I paid debts I did not create. I financed celebrations where I was treated like an inconvenience. I protected reputations that were built by humiliating me. I believed one more sacrifice might finally purchase the affection I had been denied. There is no price that can buy healthy love from people committed to using you. That was the final calculation. Once I understood that, everything became simpler. The $336,000 was never the real fortune at stake. My future was. The $1.2 million margin call was never the real trap. Their entitlement was. The corporate takeover was not the most important acquisition I made. The most important thing I ever took ownership of was my own right to decide who had access to me. So if you are listening to this, while someone in your own life is telling you that blood gives them permission to cross your boundaries, remember what happened at that table. A shared last name is not a banking credential. A childhood memory is not a signature on a blank check. A parent does not become entitled to your adulthood because they raised you. A sibling does not inherit your labor because they made reckless choices. Love is not measured by how much damage you are willing to absorb without leaving. You can love someone and still lock the door. You can forgive someone and still block the number. You can wish someone healing and still refuse to finance another rescue. You can remember the good moments without volunteering for another bad one. Boundaries are not the opposite of love. Sometimes they are the only reason love for yourself survives. I raised the wine glass slightly and watched the city lights fracture across its surface. I did not toast to my parents losing their home. I did not toast to Chloe losing her status. I did not toast to Marcus sitting behind federal walls. I toasted to the fact that none of them could reach into my life and rearrange it anymore. That was the revenge they never understood. They thought I wanted to see them suffer. What I wanted was to stop suffering for them. They thought taking my money would keep me useful. What they actually did was teach me to protect every dollar, every signature, every hour, and every ounce of peace. They thought they could take everything from me because I had once been a daughter desperate for love. They forgot one thing: never demand access to the account of a woman who has quietly learned how to buy the institution controlling the account. I leaned back against the sofa as the camera continued its slow pull away. My expression was calm, not angry. I did not need anger anymore. The glass walls reflected the Atlanta skyline behind me, but the real image was simpler than any display of wealth. It was a woman sitting in complete control of her own life. Your value does not exist in the eyes of people who only notice you when they need something. Your worth is not reduced because a parent refuses to recognize it, because a sibling resents it, or because an outsider believes status gives them permission to disrespect you. The moment you stop negotiating your dignity, the entire power structure changes. Blood can create relatives. Respect creates family. And the sweetest revenge is not watching toxic people lose everything. It is realizing they no longer have the power to take your smile.